Alright, for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how should I find the roots. Our objectives are to identify the form of the quadratic and determine the best way to find roots. Vocabulary is actually some old stuff. Just going over the forms of quadratics. So we've got vertex form, as you can see, factored form, and general form. So understanding these forms is how we're going to identify what quadratic we have, and then we're going to use that to determine how to find the roots. The first two are pretty straightforward. Vertex form. If you have something in the form of vertex form, such as this, we have our solving method. If you remember, we turned it into a three-step method. One is to get rid of math outside the square. So when we say get rid of all the math on the outside, we're talking about this times 6 and the minus 4. We should know which to get rid of first and how to work from that. Then we want a square root. And split into two problems. So we want to square root our problems and then split it into two problems. And third step is to solve both problems. So if you get vertex form, that's probably our quickest method. If we get factored form, what we like to do is use the zero product property. So here we've got factored form. What the zero product property does, if you remember, is we can take all the parts, and if we can set them equal to 0, then the whole thing is 0, meaning that's a root. So 2, that can't be set equal to 0, but x plus 4 equals 0, then we can solve for x. This can equal to 0, x minus 7 equals 0, and we can solve for x. So if we have factored form, really, really quick way of doing it. And then there's the tough choice, which is general form. In general form, we really have three different methods of finding roots. We have the quadratic formula, we have factoring, and then if we factor it, we have the zero product property because of factored form, and we have completing the square, which is a version of using vertex form and solving. So what I have is I have my method for kind of determining which one to use. A fallback is the quadratic formula works all the time. Not all problems are factorable. Some are really tough to complete the square. Quadratic formula works all the time. But for me personally, I typically look at the quadratic formula, and anytime a does not equal 1, so doesn't equal 1, such as a 2 in the a spot, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. It's just because factoring and completing the square a little bit more difficult if the a value is not 1. Okay? For factoring, again, I look for, does it have an a equaling 1? And then, this is kind of a weird one to explain, but if I have a good idea of what times what is going to give me my c value, so here I have plus 4. So I know that a positive 4 comes from 2 times 2, 1 times 4, 4 times 1, negative 1 times negative 4, negative 4 times negative 1, negative 2 times negative 2. I know those off the top of my head. And I can then go, well, what plus what equals b? So I've got a positive 4 here. Well, this is actually a pretty easy one to factor. I can go 2 times 2 equals 4, and 2 plus 2 equals 4. So those two numbers both give me the two numbers I need here. This one's easy to factor, and so I would probably factor this one to work it. Completing the square, I go a equals 1, and factoring seems hard. So here I've got negative 24. Well, there's a lot of things that can make negative 24, and any of those things I have to be able to add them together to get a negative 8. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. The closest one I can think of is a negative 12 and a positive 2, but when I add those together, I get a negative 10. So that one would be easier to complete the square. Alright, so now we're going to look at a few and try and come up with what we want to do. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video, write these down, write down what your answers would be to them, and then watch what I've got. Alright, I'll give you a second. Okay, so this first one, I have an a value of 1. I've got 8. Well, 8 can come from 8 and 1, or it can come from 2 and 4. And since it's positive, and this is positive, I'm looking at all positive answers. So 2 and 4 can also make 6. I would probably factor this. Again, if you chose quadratic formula, that would work. This one also would work for completing the square. This one, because a value is not 1, I would definitely go with the quadratic formula for this. For this one, what I've got is I've got an a value of 1, negative 9. I can't really think of anything that creates negative 9 that would then make positive 2 when I add. So for this one, I would either use the quadratic formula as a fallback, or I would complete the square. CTS, complete the square. This one's already factored. I'd use zero product property. For number 5 here, this one's already in vertex form, so I would just solve it. I'd put 0 in for y and solve. This one, a value of 6, I would use the quadratic formula. And this one, already in vertex form, I would just solve. And this last one, I've got an a value of 1, quadratic formula will work. I've got 4, which comes from 1 and 4, 2 and 2, things like that. Well, 1 and 4 added together also make 5, so I would probably try and factor this. And once I factor, I can use the zero product property. Okay, thank you. If there's any part of this that you didn't understand, please pause it, rewind, rewatch, and see if that helps you out. Thank you.